The courtroom was silent, save for the quiet shuffle of papers and the hum of the air conditioning. The air hostess stood at the defendant's table, her face pale and her hands trembling. She avoided eye contact with the black man sitting high above, his face calm, but his eyes sharp and unrelenting. He was the judge. "Ms. Caroline Edwards," the judge began, his voice steady but laced with an edge that silenced the entire room. "You stand accused of assault and discrimination against a passenger under federal aviation law. Do you understand the charges?" Caroline's heart raced as her lawyer whispered something in her ear, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the incident that had brought her here. Her lips quivered as she finally glanced upon Lee to lock eyes with the same man she had humiliated just weeks ago. It was him, the same man she had sneered at, accused of being a security threat, and had thrown off the flight for no reason other than his skin color. The same man whose calm dignity and quiet pain she had ignored while her colleagues had pleaded for her to reconsider. How could this be? He was just a passenger, wasn't he? But now, he was the judge. And the room held its breath as they waited for what would come next. Caroline Edwards was known among her colleagues as efficient and thorough, though some whispered she could be a little too strict. On this particular morning, she strode into the airport, her blonde hair tied neatly into a bun, her uniform pressed and perfect. Her day began like any other, with a routine safety briefing, some light banter with her team, and passengers boarding the plane. Among the passengers was Henry Bryant, a black man in his 60s with a quiet demeanor and a weary look in his eyes. Dressed in a sharp gray suit and carrying a well-worn leather briefcase, he looked like someone who had seen the world and its ugliness. Henry was on his way to attend a memorial for his younger brother, who had died years ago at the hands of a police officer. The loss still weighed on him like an anchor, but he had learned to carry the burden with quiet strength. Today was no different. He simply wanted to reach his destination without trouble. But trouble found him. As Henry moved toward his seat in business class, Caroline's eyes narrowed. Something about him, his confident stride, his refusal to shrink under her scrutinizing gaze bothered her. She decided to confront him. "Excuse me, sir," she said sharply, stepping into his path. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Henry handed it to her without a word. She scrutinized it longer than necessary, her lips pursing. "You're in business class?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "Yes," Henry replied, his voice calm but firm. Caroline handed the pass back but didn't move aside. "You'll need to check your luggage." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" "Just a routine check," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She waved for security to inspect his briefcase, drawing the attention of other passengers. As Henry waited patiently, security officers rifled through his belongings under Caroline's watchful eye. Her colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, sensing something wasn't right. After all, it wasn't standard protocol to single out a passenger without cause, especially one who had already passed through multiple security checks. "Is there an issue, Caroline?" asked one of the male flight attendants, a young man named Jordan, stepping closer to her. "Just following protocol," she replied curtly, refusing to meet his gaze. The officers eventually found nothing unusual in Henry's bag. He stood silently as they repacked his items, his expression calm but tinged with a quiet weariness. He had experienced this sort of treatment before, though it never stung any less. "You're clear," one officer finally said, handing the bag back. "Thank you," Henry replied, his voice steady. He moved toward his seat, but before he could sit down, Caroline's voice rang out again. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Henry froze, his hand still on the armrest of his seat. He turned slowly, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "And why is that?" he asked. Caroline hesitated for a split second before replying. "I have concerns about your behavior. It's for the safety of everyone on board." Henry's expression darkened, but he remained composed. "What behavior? I haven't said or done anything to warrant this. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said, her tone sharpening. "I will call security if necessary." At this, several passengers began murmuring, and one even spoke up. "He didn't do anything." "This is ridiculous," a woman shouted from a few rows back. Jordan and another flight attendant, an older woman named Linda, stepped forward. Caroline, Linda said in a low voice, this isn't right. He hasn't done anything wrong. You're going to escalate this unnecessarily. Caroline glared at them. I'm in charge here, she snapped. If you're not going to back me up, stay out of it. But Jordan wasn't about to back down. He turned to Henry, his voice apologetic. Sir, I'm so sorry. This isn't right. Please let me try to fix this. Henry raised a hand, signaling Jordan to stop. Thank you, but it's clear she's made up her mind. I will leave. I don't want to cause a scene. His calm dignity only made the situation more uncomfortable. As he collected his belongings and prepared to leave, other passengers voiced their disapproval. One woman even recorded the incident on her phone, capturing Carolyn's sharp tone and Henry's quiet resignation. As Henry walked back through the airport terminal, his heart was heavy, but his stride was steady. He had faced worse in his life, and had learned not to let moments like this consume him. Still, the sting of humiliation lingered. The memorial he attended that weekend was a somber reminder of the deep scars racism had left on his family. His brother, a promising artist, had been shot during a routine traffic stop. A life ended because someone had decided he looked suspicious. Henry had carried that pain for years, channeling it into his career as a lawyer and eventually a judge. He had sworn to fight for justice, knowing the world often fell short of it. Little did Caroline know, her actions that day would lead to consequences she could never have imagined. Back in the courtroom, Caroline's lawyer fumbled through a defense, arguing that her actions were rooted in protocol and not prejudice. But the evidence, video recordings, witness statements, and her own colleagues' testimonies painted a different picture. Judge Bryant listened intently, his expression unreadable. When it was finally his turn to speak, the room seemed to hold its breath. Ms. Edwards, he began, his voice steady, do you understand the weight of your actions? Caroline's lips trembled, but she didn't respond. People like you, he continued, are the reason families like mine have empty seats at dinner tables. Your baseless actions stemmed from a bias you refuse to acknowledge, and it is my responsibility to hold you accountable. His words hung in the air, heavy and unflinching. The courtroom remained silent, every eye fixed on the man who had been humiliated, but had refused to be broken. Carolyn swallowed hard, her face flushed with shame. She felt the eyes of the courtroom drilling into her, passengers she had wronged, her colleagues who had begged her to stop, and even strangers who had seen the viral video of her actions. Each gaze felt like a spotlight exposing her deepest flaws, but none were as piercing as Judge Bryant's calm, unwavering stare. Ms. Edwards, Judge Bryant continued, your actions went beyond a simple lapse in judgment. You made a decision rooted in prejudice, one that not only humiliated an innocent man, but endangered the trust passengers place in airline staff to treat them fairly. Caroline's lawyer stood. Your Honor, with respect, my client deeply regrets her actions and has suffered enough public backlash. Regret without accountability is meaningless, Judge Bryant interrupted, his tone sharp. I've heard your excuses, counselor, but this case is not about the defendant's discomfort with public opinion. It's about justice. As the trial continued, Caroline's colleagues took the stand, one by one. Jordan, the young flight attendant, spoke first. I told Caroline she was wrong, he said, his voice steady but emotional. There was no reason to single out Mr. Bryant. He was polite, followed every request, and never caused any trouble. The only thing unusual about him was the color of his skin, and that seemed to be enough for her. Linda, the senior flight attendant, echoed Jordan's sentiments. I've worked with Caroline for years, and while she's competent, I've noticed a pattern. She's harsher with certain passengers, those who don't look like her. We all saw what happened that day. It was wrong. Even passengers testified, their accounts painting a damning picture of Caroline's behavior. One woman, who had recorded the incident, described her disbelief. He was so calm. I couldn't believe how much grace he showed, even as she embarrassed him in front of everyone. The video was played in court, showing Henry's quiet dignity and Caroline's accusatory tone. Gasps filled the room as the footage ended, and even Caroline couldn't stop a tear from slipping down her cheek. During a break in the trial, Caroline sat alone in the hallway, her hands shaking. Jordan approached her cautiously. Caroline, he began softly, I don't think you're a bad person, but you need to own up to what you did. Mr. Bryant didn't deserve any of this. None of it. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she whispered. I thought I was doing my job. Jordan sighed. Maybe you thought that, but your bias clouded your judgment. It's time to face the truth. When the trial resumed, Judge Bryant delivered his ruling. Ms. Edwards, the evidence against you is overwhelming. Your actions were not only discriminatory but also dangerous, as they undermined the safety and trust required in your profession. You're hereby sentenced to 6 months of community service with a mandatory diversity and inclusion training program. Additionally, I am recommending to your employer that you undergo a full review of your fitness to serve as a flight attendant. Caroline's shoulders slumped as the words sank in. It wasn't jail, but it was a harsh reminder of the damage she had caused. As the courtroom emptied, Henry stood to leave, his presence commanding but quiet. As he walked past Caroline, she managed to whisper, "I'm sorry." He stopped and looked at her, his face unreadable. After a moment, he replied, "Words are a start. Actions are what matter." With that, he walked away, leaving her to reckon with the consequences of her actions and the work she had to do to change. Caroline completed her sentence and began attending the mandated training. At first, she resisted, but as she listened to stories from people who had faced discrimination, she started to see the world through their eyes. She realized how much pain her actions had caused and vowed to do better. Meanwhile, Henry continued his work as a judge, using his experiences to inspire change. Though the pain of losing his brother never faded, he found solace in knowing he could fight for justice, one case at a time. The incident on the flight became a turning point, not just for Caroline, but for everyone involved. It was a reminder of the power of accountability, the importance of empathy, and the strength of a man who refused to let prejudice define him. Years passed, and life moved forward for both Caroline and Henry. For Caroline, the court case and its aftermath had been a turning point. She completed her community service and diversity training, emerging with a newfound awareness and determination to do better. The airline decided to give her another chance after her suspension, but she returned to work with a different mindset. She no longer saw her role as just enforcing rules. She saw it as an opportunity to serve with fairness and compassion. For Henry, the years were marked by quiet but powerful victories. His courtroom became known for its fair rulings and deep empathy, earning him widespread respect. He had also started a foundation in his brother's name, advocating for racial justice and helping young people pursue careers in law. Despite the challenges, Henry found peace in knowing he was making a difference. On a bright morning at the same bustling airport where their paths had first crossed, Caroline now stood on the other side of the counter, not as an air hostess, but as a passenger. After years of service, she had taken a short sabbatical to reflect and recharge. This flight was part of a personal retreat, a journey she hoped would mark the next chapter of her life. She boarded the plane, her heart light, but her thoughts reflective. She found her seat and settled in, gazing out the window at the endless sky. The boarding announcement droned on in the back, ground until her ears caught a familiar name. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome a very special passenger today, Judge Henry Bryant. Please join us in thanking him for his dedication to justice and community service. Caroline's breath caught as she looked up to see him entering the cabin, his familiar gray suit now accented with a lapel pin for his foundation. He moved with the same quiet dignity, greeting the flight attendants and passengers with a warm smile. Henry took his seat just a row ahead of hers, unaware of her presence. Caroline felt her chest tighten, a rush of emotions flooding her: shame, gratitude, and a quiet hope for forgiveness. As the flight leveled off at cruising altitude, Caroline found herself rehearsing words in her head. She had thought about him often over the years, wondering if he had ever forgiven her or if she even deserved it. Finally, she stood and walked toward his seat. Clearing her throat softly, she said, "Excuse me, Judge Bryant." Henry turned, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, neither spoke. Recognition flickered in his gaze, but his expression remained calm. "I don't know if you remember me," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "but I need to say something. I'm sorry, truly, for everything." Henry studied her for a long moment before nodding. I remember you, he said, his tone neither harsh nor forgiving, just measured. It's been a long time. It has, Caroline said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. And in that time, I've changed. Because of you. Because of what happened. I wanted you to know that. Henry regarded her with the same thoughtful expression he had worn in court all those years ago. Then, slowly, he smiled a small, genuine smile. Change is good, he said simply, and so is taking responsibility. Thank you for telling me. The tension in Caroline's chest eased, replaced by a warmth she hadn't expected. Thank you, she said softly, before returning to her seat. As the plane flew through the endless expanse of blue sky, Henry glanced out the window. Somewhere, he thought, his brother was watching, and though the world wasn't perfect, moments like these gave him hope that it could change one person, one choice at a time. Caroline sat quietly, staring at the clouds, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed. Life, she realized, was full of second chances, not just to be forgiven, but to become better. And on that flight, high above the earth, two lives crossed again, not in conflict, but in understanding.